January 26, 1945, Holzwehr, France. A German soldier from the 2nd Mountain Division looked through the aid station window as medics brought in the wounded. His unit, 250 men and 6 tanks strong, had just attacked a single American lieutenant atop a burning tank destroyer. The American had only 1 machine gun. Within an hour, the German force was reduced to just 70 combat-effective men. The survivors could talk of nothing but the weapon that had stopped them cold. It wasn't a secret German wonder weapon or a technological marvel. It was the simple Browning M2 .50 caliber heavy machine gun, first produced in 1933, which was becoming the most feared piece of equipment in the American arsenal. Its power came not from complexity, but from brutal, relentless effectiveness. The German survivors had just witnessed what would become one of the most legendary engagements in American military history. First Lieutenant Audie Murphy, wounded and alone, had climbed onto a burning M10 tank destroyer and turned its turret-mounted .50 caliber machine gun on an entire German infantry company supported by armor. For over an hour, Murphy fired with such devastating effect that the German attack simply disintegrated. The official Medal of Honor citation confirmed that Murphy inflicted approximately 50 casualties. The wounds caused by the .50 caliber became grimly familiar to German medical personnel. Unlike rifle rounds, which often wounded and allowed for recovery, the .50 caliber projectile caused catastrophic tissue damage. The massive kinetic energy transfer meant a hit to a limb often resulted in amputation, and a hit to the torso was almost invariably fatal. German field hospitals near the front lines quickly learned to recognize .50 caliber casualties by the nature of their wounds, and there was little medical personnel could do but offer comfort and attempt stabilization for evacuation. Many wounded never even reached a field hospital. The psychological impact also extended beyond direct casualties. German units under sustained .50 caliber fire suffered higher rates of psychological casualties, combat exhaustion, and breakdown of unit cohesion than units facing conventional small arms. The knowledge that cover offered no safety, that luck rather than skill determined survival, created a medically and militarily significant sense of helplessness. The Holzwehr action was not an isolated event. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German soldiers learned to recognize and fear the distinctive sound. The deep, rhythmic thunder of the M2 Browning firing between 450 and 575 rounds per minute. Each massive .50 caliber round carried enough energy to punch through light armor, tear through concrete, and turn human bodies into unrecognizable wreckage. The transformation from skepticism to terror had begun 3 years earlier. The mathematics of American industrial might were being written not in production statistics, but in the experience of German soldiers who faced this weapon and survived to tell about it. What they discovered shattered their understanding of modern warfare. The United States hadn't built the most sophisticated heavy machine gun. They had built the most reliable, most ubiquitous, and most psychologically devastating crew-served weapon in history. The hatred began not with fear, but with contempt. On September 6, 1943, over Stuttgart, 388 B-17 Flying Fortresses approached Germany's industrial heartland in the first major daylight raid on the city. Luftwaffe fighter units, including veterans who had shot down dozens of Allied aircraft, scrambled to intercept. Confident in their Focke-Wulf 19 aircraft, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, the German pilots rolled into their attack runs from high and ahead, the standard doctrine for intercepting American heavies. At 800 meters, they opened fire. Then, the bombers erupted with fire, not the smoke of damaged aircraft, but muzzle flashes. Each B-17 carried 13 Browning M2 machine guns. A typical 36 bomber formation meant 468 heavy machine guns, all firing the .50 cartridge that was lethal out to 1830 meters. The formation's combined defensive firepower exceeded 6,000 rounds per minute, creating a wall of steel that no fighter could safely penetrate. German pilots felt their aircraft shudder as .50 caliber rounds tore into wings, engine cowlings, and canopies. They broke off attacks, diving away with aircraft trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid. The raid cost the Luftwaffe heavily, with catastrophic losses of experienced pilots. What the German pilots didn't yet grasp was that they were encountering not just a weapon, but a philosophy of warfare. The Americans had solved the problem of bomber defense not through technological sophistication, but through overwhelming volume of fire. Each B-17G carried between 5,000 and 7,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to respect 20mm and 30mm cannons, which could destroy a bomber with one well-placed explosive shot. But the American .50 didn't need to explode. The massive, half-inch diameter projectile traveling at 2,900 feet per second and carrying 12,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy simply punched holes in everything it touched: wings, engines, fuel tanks, pilots. By October 1943, the Luftwaffe began to understand the true danger. Oberleutnant Heinrich Wormsele, an ace with 93 victories, described the American bomber formations. To attack the Americans is to fly through a storm of steel. He noted that for every tracer round visible, 4 more invisible bullets were flying past, and closing to effective cannon range meant entering their killing zone. The Germans adapted their tactics, trying head-on attacks, diving, climbing, and side attacks. Nothing worked consistently. American gunners had overlapping fields of fire. The B-17 formations were arranged specifically to maximize this overlapping defensive fire. But the real horror was the reliability. German pilots knew their cannons were prone to jamming in the cold, high-altitude air. The American Browning M2, by contrast, simply worked. It fired continuously for hours, operated reliably from -40°C to +40°C, and kept shooting even when barrels glowed red from sustained fire. American crews could replace overheated barrels in minutes. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, a bomber intercept pilot, captured the growing realization among German aircrews in 1946. We called the American bomber formations die fliegenden Festungen, the flying fortresses. But what made them true fortresses was not their armor or their formation discipline. It was those .50 caliber machine guns that never stopped firing, never jammed, never gave us an opening. We lost so many pilots, not to American fighters, but to the bomber defensive fire. It was like flying into a meat grinder. The ground war told the same story. On June 6, 1944, in Normandy, Oberst Hans von Luck commanded elements of the 21st Panzer Division. Von Luck, an officer who later published the acclaimed memoir Panzer Commander, found that American doctrine had placed the .50 caliber machine gun on virtually every combat vehicle. Jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, tanks, and even supply vehicles carried them. The Americans had achieved universal heavy machine gun coverage across their entire force structure, a scale the Germans had never attempted. Von Luck wrote that he had been told German tactics would overcome American material advantage, but at Normandy he learned the truth. The Americans did not need superior tactics. They had enough ammunition to make mistakes and still win. Their .50 caliber machine guns were on every vehicle, every position, firing continuously. We could not move in daylight. Any attempt to maneuver drew immediate and overwhelming fire. The German army built its doctrine around the machine gun, with the MG-42 being an excellent weapon that fired at 1,200 rounds per minute. But the Germans had never imagined the sheer scale of American .50 caliber employment. An American armored division advancing through France would have hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns mounted on its vehicles. American supply convoys used a documented pattern of alternating fire, one vehicle shooting right, the next shooting left, to cover both flanks and break up German ambushes. This was particularly effective against Panzerfaust teams trying to engage American armor at close range. American armored columns also employed reconnaissance by fire. Instead of carefully advancing, American units would fire their .50 caliber machine guns continuously into any suspicious location: tree lines, farm buildings, stone walls, hedgerows. This volume of fire would either suppress hidden German positions or provoke return fire that revealed their locations. German infantry veterans of the Eastern Front, who thought they had experienced the worst of industrial warfare against the Soviets, found American firepower in France devastating. As German squad leaders recounted in debriefings, against the Russians, we faced human wave attacks and artillery barrages. Against the Americans, we faced machine gun fire that never stopped. They fired at everything. They fired at nothing. They fired to make us keep our heads down. They fired to prevent us from moving. They fired because they had unlimited ammunition, and we did not. After 2 weeks of fighting in the hedgerows, soldiers would not leave cover during daylight. Movement meant death. The M16 multiple gun motor carriage demonstrated American firepower philosophy at its most extreme. This half-track mounted 4.5 caliber machine guns in a powered turret, with a combined rate of fire approaching 2,200 rounds per minute. American soldiers called it the meat chopper or the Kraut mower. Originally designed for anti-aircraft defense, by late 1944 its primary mission became ground support. During the Battle of the Bulge, M16 units were credited with breaking up numerous German infantry attacks. German doctrine for convoy ambush called for letting the lead vehicles pass, then destroying the middle ones to create a roadblock, and then systematically destroying the trapped convoy. This had worked effectively against British and Soviet supply lines. Against American convoys, the tactic failed catastrophically. American convoy doctrine placed .5 caliber armed vehicles throughout the column. When an ambush was initiated, American vehicles would immediately return fire with their .5 calibers, while others maneuvered to flank the position. The volume of return fire was so intense that German ambush teams frequently suffered heavier casualties than the convoys they attacked. The psychological effect of being under fire from multiple directions by weapons that could penetrate cover and had seemingly unlimited ammunition made successful ambushes nearly impossible. This failure to interrupt American logistics had strategic implications. American units could count on regular resupply, meaning tactical planning could assume firepower would be available. German planning, by contrast, had to account for chronic shortages. The .5 caliber machine gun was both a cause and a symptom of American logistical superiority. It was effective because American industry could produce ammunition in vast quantities. The terror from the air added another dimension. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighter carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns in its wings. A single P-47 could deliver 4,400 rounds per minute during strafing runs. German ground forces learned to recognize the P-47's distinctive shape and the sound that preceded death. A strafing run by a flight of 4 P-47s meant 32 .5 caliber machine guns converging on a target. The effect was described by survivors as a horizontal rainstorm of metal that left nothing intact. German ground troops felt helpless against American air power. Stone walls crumbled, trees were cut down, and metal tore like paper. Soldiers learned to abandon vehicles the moment they heard aircraft engines, preferring to lose the vehicle than the vehicle and the crew. The combination of ground-mounted and air-delivered .5 caliber fire created a comprehensive suppression effect. German units couldn't move safely in daylight because of strafing attacks. They couldn't move safely at night because American ground forces used reconnaissance by fire with vehicle-mounted .5 calibers to interdict roads. This was the reality that broke German combat effectiveness in the West. Not a single decisive battle or a wonder weapon, but the cumulative weight of facing an opponent whose basic heavy machine gun was present in overwhelming quantities and employed so lavishly that traditional military responses became irrelevant. Urban combat revealed another dimension of its effectiveness. The massive projectile could penetrate multiple walls of typical European masonry. American tank commanders learned to use their turret-mounted .5 calibers to suppress upper-story windows and rooftop positions before moving through urban areas. The sustained fire would force German defenders to take cover, allowing infantry to advance. Panzerfaust operators, highly effective in urban terrain, needed to expose themselves to aim and fire their weapons. But American doctrine called for continuous .5 caliber fire on any suspected position.
making successful anti-tank attacks rare. German soldiers in urban terrain understood that walls and buildings provided concealment, but not cover, against .5 caliber fire. Watching .5 caliber rounds punch through meter-thick stone walls and multiple rooms destroyed the psychological comfort that shelter normally provided. Units would eventually abandon positions without being directly assaulted, because they knew American firepower would eventually make the positions untenable. Night combat introduced yet another terror. American ammunition used a ratio of 1 tracer round to every 4 ball rounds. German soldiers watching the tracer-laden .5 caliber fire at night could see the glowing traces arcing toward them. They could see death approaching. They knew that for every tracer they saw, 4 additional rounds were flying along the same path. Veterans learned not to watch the tracers, but new replacements would fixate on them, mesmerized by the deadly light show, often freezing in the open. American forces deliberately exploited this psychological effect with reconnaissance by fire at night, sending streams of tracer-laden .5 caliber fire across suspected positions. The noise, combined with the overwhelming visual effect, created an environment that German soldiers described as hellish. Captured German squad leaders described the experience. At night, you can see them shooting even when they cannot see you. The tracers show you where death is coming from, and you cannot escape it. You cannot survive that volume of fire by skill or courage. You survive by luck alone. While the Germans had their own tracer ammunition, their doctrine of fire discipline meant tracers were used sparingly. American crews fired mixed belts continuously, giving American commanders better real-time feedback to adjust and concentrate their fire more effectively. General Major Fritz Badelein, who commanded a Panzer Grenadier division near Saint-Lô during Operation Cobra, wrote that his division had been decimated not primarily by bombing or artillery, but by the cumulative effect of constant small arms fire that prevented his forces from maneuvering effectively. His conclusion was that Americans had solved the fundamental problem of modern warfare. They had found a way to project superior firepower without requiring superior training or tactics. He noted repeatedly that the .5 caliber machine gun, operated by soldiers with minimal specialized training and supplied with vast quantities of ammunition, created a baseline of firepower that German forces could not match. The technical specifications help explain its effectiveness. The M2 had an effective range of 1,830 meters, beyond the range of German rifles and light machine guns. Its rate of fire, while slower than the MG-42, meant nothing when German crews had limited ammunition. Armor-piercing incendiary variants could penetrate the thinner side and rear armor of many German armored vehicles. More importantly, it could destroy truck engines, puncture fuel tanks, disable artillery pieces, and suppress infantry at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The M2's reliability stemmed from its simple, robust design, which John Browning began developing in 1917. The scale of production: American manufacturers produced nearly 2 million .5 caliber machine guns of all models during the war years, meant American forces never lacked for replacement weapons or spare parts. The Germans understood that their own weapons, like the MG-42, were in many respects more sophisticated. But sophistication meant nothing against overwhelming material superiority. The Americans had built a weapon that was good enough for every role and produced it in quantities that allowed universal employment. The psychological impact was cumulative and devastating. Over weeks and months of combat, the constant knowledge that the Americans could bring overwhelming fire to bear on any target at any time wore down German combat effectiveness. The Americans simply deployed overwhelming material resources and fired until resistance collapsed. The hatred German soldiers expressed for the .5 caliber was the resentment of craftsmen facing mass production, of skilled warriors facing industrial warfare. The American approach relied on material superiority rather than superior skill. The M2 Browning represented the methods of an industrial power that had calculated that material expenditure was cheaper than casualties and more effective than tactical elegance. As former German officers consistently assessed after the war, the .5 caliber machine gun was not the most sophisticated weapon, but it was simply the most effective because it combined reliability, ubiquity, and overwhelming logistical support. The weapon itself was only part of the equation. The system that produced it by the millions, supplied it with billions of rounds of ammunition, and employed it according to doctrine that accepted material expenditure as the price of victory, that system defeated Germany. The lesson was universal and unforgiving. In industrial warfare, the side that can sustain higher material expenditure will prevail, regardless of tactical skill disparities. The Germans had brought a craftsman's approach to a mass-production war. They had conserved ammunition when their opponents could afford to expend it freely. The M2 Browning .5 caliber machine gun became the symbol and instrument of that lesson. German forces brought skill, doctrine, and determination. American forces brought an industrial system capable of producing and supplying heavy machine guns in quantities that made resistance mathematically futile. When those two approaches collided, the outcome was never truly in doubt.